Hello everybody. So I wanted to talk again about the story of Adam and Eve, which a lot of people say is just a mythical thing. It couldn't be possible that we began in a Garden of Eden, there was a snake and all these sorts of things. Then other people say, well, it's actually should be literally true. We all are based on a single breeding pair. We're all related to each other, all humans. But then, of course, we have the issue of their children and how did they mate with each other? Did they all have sex with Eve several times over, the three sons? Or were there daughters that weren't counted, then that therefore they had sex with their sisters? And all this sort of stuff. And what I'm going to look at is a possibility that it was a true story, but perhaps got changed a little bit over the years. Not that it was meant to be deliberately lied about, or it was mythology, or it was an exaggeration, so much as it was our understanding. Now, I start with this, with what Adam means literally, and it literally translates to red-headed one. Now, some people have argued, I've heard this argument that, oh, actually it was meant to be the red dirt where he was made. Alright, can accept that. But then what about Eve? What does Eve mean? Eve means life. And you may know Christmas Eve, New Year's Eve means the day before, but it doesn't actually mean the day before. When you say Christmas Eve, you're not talking about literally the day before, you're actually saying life of Christmas. So you could actually say Christmas Eve when you're in the middle of Christmas, or at least when it starts, when you're opening your presents. So that's something we've a little bit misunderstood, but we've got Viva, Vive. We know Viva is life. Live, live, Eve. That's what that means. So why is she called that? If she was made from the ribs, you would think that she'd be named after the word for rib, which is Sella, becomes Selena. So it should have been Adam and Selena. Did we change that over the years? Got a bit confused? There's a few different confusions about that. And also, if she had red hair, she should have been called one of the names for red-headed one, which could be Scarlet. So why is it not either Adam and Scarlet or Adam and Selena? Why is she Eve? How did that come about? Why is she called Life? Why is it red-headed one and Life? And names have meaning. Shouldn't have been called Life. That doesn't make any sense. And I've never heard any explanation that suggests that it does. Why not both of them be called Life? Why have one called red-headed and the other one called Life? And if we were talking about as Christmas Eve, and you had one person called Christmas, or Noel, and the other one called Eve, we say, oh, that goes together as Christmas Eve. So why are we suggesting red-headed one and life doesn't mean that? Perhaps it means life or birth of the Adamu. And we skip over to another group called the Sumerians, who are in modern day Iraq. And of course they had a few different places, but just as a rough guess, they were there, not too far away. But they began, according to their own history, 500,000 years ago. Now, archaeologists say, well, their society only began 6,500 years ago. Whichever way you want to believe, they were certainly a long time before the Jews, who themselves claim they'd only existed for 6,000 years, or even 4,000 years, really. They think that the world was only 6,000 years old, and they'd been around for 4,000 of those years. So, either way you want to look at it, the Sumerians came first. There's no doubting the Sumerians came first. And so they have a story of an Adamu. Now they say that they already existed. They call themselves the Shinar, or black-headed ones. And Adamu, in their language, also means red-headed one, but it had a very different meaning. For them, Adamu was a new species of humans, a second type of human. And they were actually created without brains and meant to be slaves to mine gold for the Anunnaki, or gods on earth, or who some people think of as angels. But then they were freed by another type of gods on earth called Agigi, who may well have been dragons. And the Agigi freed them, gave them brains, and they ran away. Now, where did they run to? Well, what if they moved to somewhere that was thought of as the Garden of Eden? yes, they could well have gone south. They wouldn't have gone north because there were already humans in Europe, but there weren't very many in southern Africa. Most of southern Africa had been flooded. Below the Sahara, or what is now the Sahara Desert, the southern three quarters of Africa had been below water until about 500,000 years ago. And so there weren't very many people living there. Mozambique itself claims they've only had people 100,000 years. And so there wouldn't have been very many people, if any at all. A good place to run and hide from their pursuers. And perhaps then they skipped across onto the islands that we know of as Madagascar and Mauritius. But in those days, could well have been, and probably were, above water with quite a big area. And they could have skipped across them and gone on to India. And India, for a long time, was floating. It floated all the way from Australia, snapped off from the Great Australian Bight. That's where India was. And then it floated from there up to Africa and eventually joined where it is now in southern Asia. It's called a subcontinent because it's not a part of Asia. It might be attached to there, but the continent is separate and it is a part of Australia. Even though it's not physically attached to Australia, that's where India is part of Australia. So what if the Neanderthals, the Adamu, who I believe, pretty sure they were the Neanderthal, because around about that time is when the Neanderthals first began. 400,000 years ago is when the Neanderthals first arrived, whilst Homo sapiens were about 800,000 years ago. So, and we'd had other humans before Homo sapiens, of course. So, soon after the Anunnaki and all them arrived, they created the Adamu 400,000 years ago. 100,000 years later, matches up quite well. Then they escaped, went to India, and perhaps that's when India was floating. We don't really know because it's a bit hard to get too precise with the movements of that sort of thing. And India at that stage was known as Bharat, which means land of the Aryas. And you've heard of Aryans? What if Aryans wasn't a race but was actually a different human species that were the people that were in India? Now they would have started off as Homo sapiens, or perhaps with the red hair, who knows, but they over time isolated like that on that island, which was India. They would have had very few predators. Okay, so there's a few tigers and whatnot, but not that many, and enough to keep them strong. But perhaps they would have got smart because they would have known there's pursuers and they would eventually meet up with them. So they became smart, and we know how smart the Neanderthals were. They were much smarter than Homo sapiens. So they developed that on their island and developed their own religion, which became Hinduism, and also invented Judaism. Judaism having Adam and Eve. And so they created that as part of their understanding of their own birth, of their own creation, not as two people, but as a species. And of course then, once the Indian subcontinent landed on southern Asia, created mountains, and they all went there and invaded Europe and created the great Bharat Empire. And then of course they had the war with the Homo sapiens. They would have won it, except for then the Denisovans came in from possibly Russia and helped out the Homo sapiens. Then of course the Neanderthals killed the Denisovans and pretty much wiped themselves out in the process. A few Neanderthals survived right up until about 12,000 years ago, and then they were killed with the last cataclysm. And of course there's stories that the Neanderthals possibly built the pyramids, may have been responsible for the building of Atlantis, and may have continued to exist as pharaohs until Alexander the Great and Macedonia and later Greece conquered Egypt and got rid of them. That all makes sense. And if that's the case, and look, we know that Neanderthals were a real species, and we know that we interacted with them, we know that they existed all around the world, perhaps not every single part of the world, but most of the world. We interbred with them. People today have Neanderthal DNA. Most people either have Neanderthal or Denisovan or both. And the only part that don't are in sub-Saharan Africa, which people in Africa, that means south of the Sahara Desert, which would make sense because there wouldn't be any there, because if they fled down there they would have all left to go to India. And so that all makes quite a lot of sense. And therefore that story about Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden wasn't a cautionary tale at all. It was perhaps saying not Adam and Eve as two people, but the birth of the Adamu, the Neanderthals. And that leaving the Garden of Eden was leaving India to go to Europe, which in turn led to their own annihilation. And perhaps that was the cautionary tale, that they thought they were so strong, so clever, so good, but they weren't really. And that was what happened. And all of the sins of the past, all of the, even not that they really sinned, but when they escaped from slavery, that was what happened to them. So that's an interesting little story. Look, it's a theory. I don't know for sure that it's true, but it's one that makes sense of the Adam and Eve story and makes it quite believable. It fits in with the scientific narrative and with the stories from other religions. That Neanderthals were not just some little weak group of people that we just wiped out as soon as we met them. No, because we know that humans existed in Europe long before the Neanderthals arrived. And perhaps rather than the Neanderthals coming from Germany, as some people had assumed, they'd actually come from India. And that they came from India when India was an island, and even originally came from the southern parts of Africa, and in turn from Sumer, from Iraq, but going south and then back up north. And look, I don't know for sure, but that's something that makes sense, because why would we want to brag about annihilating an entire species? We would probably be ashamed of doing that. So we have therefore adopted some of their religion and some of their beliefs, which we know the Romans did to the Greeks. We know that many cultures have done to each other when they've conquered them. They've pretended that the conquered group's history is their own history. And perhaps that's what we did. Anyway, that's it from me. Bye-bye.